In the mid to late 1930s, Germany started the process of rebuilding her navy after the disastrous defeat in World War I and the restrictions placed upon her by the Treaty of Versailles. Germany had almost no major capital ships to start with, except for a couple of ancient pre-dreadnoughts. Plan Z, which was formulated in 1938 and partially implemented in 1939, would have seen the Germans with a total of 10 battleships by 1948. There was one problem. The war started later in 1939, and the plan fell apart. So, when the war began in September of 1939, Germany had very few U-boats, and some of the major warships laid down in the mid to late 1930s wouldn't be ready for service until 1941. Now, if you like naval history content and like the channel, please consider smashing the like button, barraging the comments, and ramming that subscribe button. During the Second World War, German naval power peaked during the first several months of 1941. The Germans had 4 very powerful capital ships, the 2 Scharnhorst-class battleships, each armed with 9 11-inch guns, as well as 2 Bismarck-class battleships, each armed with 8 15-inch guns. Alongside these large capital ships, the Germans possessed 2 Admiral Hipper-class cruisers and the remaining 2 Deutschland-class Panzerschiffs. The Germans also had a handful of destroyers and light cruisers, but these suffered from serious flaws. Compared to destroyers built by the United States, Great Britain, or many of the other powers, German destroyers tended to be very heavy and carry larger main battery guns. Many German destroyers struggled with seakeeping and could not stay out at sea for long periods of time, making them relatively ineffective commerce raiders. Most German destroyers had relatively short ranges. A Fletcher-class destroyer would have around 6,000 miles of operational range. Most German destroyers only had around 2,500 miles of operational range. Their limited operational range also meant that they could not escort the larger German capital ships on farther-reaching missions. The German light cruisers were even more unimpressive than the destroyers. Some of them suffered from massive structural issues, and they did not contribute very much to the war. By 1941, only 1 of the Königsberg-class light cruisers remained, and it was more or less strategically irrelevant. It didn't contribute much to the war, and it was usually used in some backline function. The Deutschland-class Panzerschiffs, of which 2 remained in 1941, the Lutzow and the Admiral Scheer, were actually relatively capable designs and were able to square off against a British heavy cruiser or even a couple British heavy cruisers and come out, relatively speaking, intact. The Deutschland's main armament of 6 11-inch guns and secondary armament of 8 5.9-inch guns gave them enough firepower to comfortably square off against any ship short of a battlecruiser or battleship. These ships were also armored similarly to heavy cruisers made around the same time, so they could not withstand many high-caliber hits. Next, on to the Admiral Hipper-class cruisers, probably one of the most inefficient ship designs on the entire list. This is because they were around 16,000 tons, but they had the capabilities, or similar capabilities, to a 10,000-ton cruiser. Just to make an effective comparison, this is the 10,000-ton French cruiser Algerie. The Algerie was armed with 8 8-inch guns. Now, what was the Admiral Hipper class armed with? Oh yeah, that's right. 8 8-inch guns. Maybe the Hippers have a speed advantage. I mean, they could go around, 32 knots? Well, the Algerie could go 31 knots. Well, if they basically have a comparable armament and a comparable top speed, then maybe the French made some major compromises on their armor layout. Looking at the number, the Algerie only had around a 4-inch belt. Surely, the Admiral Hipper class had to have better armor than that. Nope. In fact, the Hipper had a smaller belt of around 3 inches, though I will point out that this graphic estimates around 4. Either way, relatively comparable armor for a heavy cruiser, probably slightly inferior. Part of this comes down to the Germans having the habit of using a more distributed armor scheme, whereas the French used a more concentrated armor scheme, meaning that where the protection really counted, the Algerie actually had more, even though it was 6,000 tons lighter. So, when taking all those things into account, the Admiral Hipper isn't looking very great in this comparison. Now, what about secondary armament? I mean, we all know the Germans like to put a lot of secondary guns on their ships, and what about their respective torpedo armaments? How did these two ships stack up? The Hippers were armed with 12 4.1-inch guns and 12 21-inch torpedo tubes. Well, the Algerie wasn't all that lacking here either. It had 12 3.9-inch guns and 6 22-inch torpedo tubes. So the Algerie had a relatively comparable secondary armament. It just had slightly smaller guns and 6 fewer torpedo tubes. With all of this information about the Algerie and the Admiral Hipper class taken into consideration, when the Germans were building the Hippers, there is one other place where they could have put that extra tonnage. The Admiral Hippers, like most German capital ships, were designed for long-range commerce raiding. They had a range of about 8,000 miles, give or take a little bit. This has to be where the extra tonnage went, right? They had to have given it extra range because they were intending for it to be a commerce raider, right? Nope, the Algerie had a relatively comparable cruising range. So, the Hippers have no discernible advantage over most 10,000-ton treaty cruisers. It's probably an even match for one. It might be able to outperform one slightly, but it's basically a one-for-one. Now, by 1941, the Germans only had 2 of these Admiral Hipper-class cruisers. There was another that was nearing completion, but it would never be completed throughout the war. The 2 remaining ships were the Admiral Hipper herself and the Prince Eugen. A 3rd Admiral Hipper-class had been sunk in Oslo Fjord by a Norwegian coastal battery. There was also a hull that got sold to the Soviet Union. The 2 Scharnhorst-class battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, were actually relatively well designed and were very capable warships. They were very effective in the early war. They are likely most famous for sinking the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. The ships had a very respectable main armament of 9 11-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. They also had 12 5.9-inch guns and 14 4.1-inch guns, which meant that they could go up against any heavy cruiser very comfortably and could likely be a match for a British battle cruiser like the Renown or the Repulse. There was an upgrade planned for the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which would have upgraded the main armament to 6 15-inch guns. If this upgrade had been completed, the Scharnhorst or Gneisenau would have been capable of squaring off against a battle cruiser such as the Renown or Repulse, though they would have likely still struggled with heavier warships. These 2 ships are, arguably, the most valuable resource that the Germans had in 1941. There was one issue, though. They were stuck in France. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau arrived in the French port of Brest in March of 1941. This port was within easy striking distance for the Royal Air Force, and the 2 battleships would struggle to get out of the port. Any German naval planner in 1941 would have to be primarily focused on getting these 2 ships out of harm's way in France and back either to Norway or to Germany. And now to cover the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, 2 of the most famous German battleships. The Bismarck entered service in 1940, and the Tirpitz entered service in early 1941. The Bismarck class is probably one of the most overrated classes of battleship ever created. The Bismarck had a decent main armament of 8 15-inch guns, but this made her actually below average when compared to her contemporaries. For example, the Japanese battleship Nagato had 8 16-inch guns and had a heavier broadside weight. The Nagato was laid down in 1917. The Japanese battleship Yamato was being built at around the same time as the Bismarck, and the Yamato sported 9 18.1-inch guns, completely blowing the Bismarck's main armament out of the water. The North Carolinas and the South Dakotas, which were being produced at around the same time as the Bismarck, all had 9 16-inch guns, meaning that they also had a superior main armament. The only contemporary capital ship that had a smaller broadside than the Bismarck was the Dunkirk and Strasbourg, which were light French battlecruisers. The most modern British battleships at the time were the King George V class. They were armed with 10 14-inch guns, and still had a higher broadside weight than the Bismarck. It should be noted that the British struggled with the quad turret design, and the numbers I'm referencing only really count if the turrets are functioning. Now, it might not come as a surprise then to learn that the USS Texas, a World War I battleship, had a larger broadside weight than the Bismarck. Since almost any capital ship afloat at the time and in active service could match or outcompete the Bismarck in terms of broadside weight, the only thing that was keeping the Bismarck safe was its speed. The Bismarck's top speed of around 30 knots meant that many of the British battleships that were deployed at the time simply could not catch up to it. There were only 3 ships in Royal Navy service that could catch the Bismarck in a pursuit, and those would be the HMS Hood, the HMS Renown, and the HMS Repulse. Now, even though the Bismarck had a somewhat mediocre main armament, one would still not want to send light cruisers or heavy cruisers to directly engage it, so having them try to chase down the Bismarck is more or less out of the question, just because they wouldn't be effective at actually stopping it. These types of ships would likely be used to shadow any capital ships that the Germans sent out to sea. The King George V class battleships could almost keep pace, but they were a couple of knots slower than the Bismarcks. So, with all that being considered, there being 3 battlecruisers that could catch up and kill the Bismarck, theoretically, and there being 2 Bismarck-class battleships, that doesn't seem like too bad a ratio. Now, that ratio changes quite a bit if the Bismarck gets slowed down, and there's a giant elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is naval aviation. Though the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had done their part by removing the HMS Glorious from existence, the British had other fleet aircraft carriers, and all that it would take is one lucky torpedo hit to send one of the Bismarck-class battleships into giant swooping circles, which would make its speed advantage more or less worthless. Now, any type of battle damage inflicted on the Bismarck or Tirpitz by one of the British battle cruisers or a swordfish or other type of British aircraft could slow the Bismarck down enough to widen the field of British vessels that could catch up with the ships. Now, if the Bismarck was slowed down enough, it would allow the Nelson and the Rodney to catch up with it. Now, on paper, they only had a speed of around 23 knots, but during the actual pursuit of the Bismarck, the Rodney may have reached speeds of up to 25 knots, which means any significant battle damage to the Bismarck would have allowed it to probably catch up, judging by historical facts. A battle between a Nelson and a Bismarck-class battleship would probably end in one way: the Bismarck-class battleship sitting on the bottom of the ocean. It should be said that this outcome is by no means guaranteed. A Bismarck-class battleship could theoretically overcome a Nelson under the right circumstances, though generally the Nelson's heavier main armament would give it an advantage in a straight-out brawl. Any type of one-on-one engagement would likely be rare, as you would probably see multiple British battleships attempting to engage a single Bismarck-class battleship. So the Bismarcks are vastly outnumbered, but overall, they're decent ships. Even if they're lackluster in some areas, they have enough advantages to make them at least somewhat competitive with their contemporaries. Though the Bismarck class's secondary battery of 4.1-inch and 5.9-inch guns wouldn't be very relevant in a capital ship engagement, it would still be valuable to have against lighter targets and while commerce raiding. The two battleships would have likely fared better if they had been sent out together. Now, historically, the Bismarck was sent out with the Prinz Eugen, and though the two of them found some success, the Bismarck was eventually hunted down by Royal Navy forces, while the Prinz Eugen was able to make it to France and became stuck with the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. So, with these forces, would Germany be able to win the naval war in 1941? The British were stretched thin, having to defend a colonial empire. In 1940, France had been knocked out of the war, and its fleet was now largely unavailable to them. The Italians threatened British naval superiority in the Mediterranean, and Japan was becoming a growing threat in the east. Still, the British Home Fleet and Force H, which was stationed around Gibraltar, posed a significant threat to the German fleet if they were to ever sortie, even if they combined all of their forces into one formation. Prior to the Bismarck's excursion, the British generally had at least 2 battle cruisers prowling around in the North Atlantic. Depending on what time in 1941, the Nelson or Rodney or both battleships would be in with the home fleet or in the North Atlantic escorting convoys. The Prince of Wales and the King George V would also likely be in the area. Supporting these capital ships would be a significant force of cruisers and destroyers, as well as likely a couple of aircraft carriers. On top of that, there might also be the random Revenge or Queen Elizabeth class battleship kicking around in the North Atlantic at any given time. The point being, German capital ships, even if all 4 of them managed to sortie together, would likely be outnumbered around 1.5 to 2 to 1. The German cruiser forces would be hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, and the German support forces probably wouldn't stand a chance. And that's also assuming that those support forces could actually make it to the battle in the first place. A further problem that would come with any given fleet engagement is even if the Germans won, their ships would likely be battle damaged and taken out of action for a prolonged period of time, whereas the British had enough forces to just shuffle some new ships into the area to replace their losses. While the Germans stopped producing capital ships through most of the war, the British continued to build capital ships throughout the war, meaning that any combat losses that Britain suffered could be replaced by those newly produced ships. The British also had far better intelligence. They were reading most of the German communications. They knew what was going on. They could track the movements of these ships with a high level of precision. So the Germans stood little chance. They had an intelligence disadvantage. Their ships were quantitatively and qualitatively inferior to those of Britain. There was never a moment throughout the war where the Germans could pose any real threat to British naval superiority. Surface fleets generally exist to gain naval dominance. The Germans wanted a surface fleet so they could commerce raid. This tends to indicate that the German surface fleet was really a waste of resources, and that those resources would have been better spent building more U-boats. While gaming out the many scenarios, I tried to see if there were any where the Germans could split off enough British forces to deal some kind of knockout blow to a formation without becoming crippled themselves. And there really isn't an option. Most times, you might get lucky once or twice, but eventually the superiority of the British Navy will catch up, and the ships that you send out will eventually get caught. Thank you for watching to this point in the video. I hope you'll consider liking the video, commenting, and subscribing. This channel covers a lot of different naval history topics, and I would appreciate the support. Also, if you see or hear anything that's incorrect, please comment down below. I'd also love to hear your opinions on what the Germans should have done during the lead-up to World War II to make their fleet more effective.